So pleased to welcome Cass Sunstein tonight to talk about his book, Simpler, The Future of Government. For 3 years, Mr. Sunstein was President Obama's, quote, regulatory czar, heading the White House Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, and he oversaw a far-reaching restructuring of America's regulatory state. In this book, he shows what was done, why he thinks Americans are better off as a result, and what the future has in store. Thank you again for coming. Please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein to Politics and Prose.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming on such a great, beautiful day, and thanks to Politics and Prose for having me. I had a discussion with my wife, Samantha Power, who's over there, about how to handle this exactly, and since I'm back to being an academic, I thought I'd give you a kind of academic lecture. And she thought that was a really bad idea, and that I should take some of the most fun parts of the book, believe it or not, there are fun parts of the book, and read them to you. And so what I thought I'd do by way of compromise, this is what I learned from government. You find paths forward, is give you 3 concepts and then read 3, not the most fun parts of the book. You're going to have to get the book to find that, but 3 of the more fun parts of the book. Okay, concept number 1, regulatory moneyball. There's a book by Michael Lewis called Moneyball, which is a movie starring Brad Pitt. Came to the White House, and I might tell you that story after, if you like. Brad Pitt at the White House. And the theme of the book in the movie is that it's important to have careful analysis of player performance and not to rely on intuitions and anecdotes and kind of recollections of success and failure. Let's get really statistical. That was the revolution that Billy Beane played a part in creating in baseball. So an idea, this is one of the 3 concepts, is that we need regulatory moneyball. If you have a rule that's going to save lives on the highways or that's going to make the air cleaner so people are healthy, those are strong points in their favor, and it's good to know the magnitude of the effect. Is it going to save half a life a year, or is it going to save 200 lives a year? Is it going to save thousands of people from getting sick, or is it going to save 1? On the other hand, if the rule is going to cost a lot of money, that's not so good, especially in an economically challenging time. A rule involving highway safety or environmental protection may cost, limited amount of money and may not be a big deal, or it may be a big cost item. If it costs a lot, the human consequences will be real. That means that consumers are going to have to pay more, not some abstraction called business, but ordinary people. And when ordinary people pay more, that can be hardship, especially if they don't have a lot of money to pay. If it's the case that small businesses are hammered by a regulation, then there are real people who aren't doing so great, maybe, who are going to end up having a wage cut or a job loss. And that means a pretty bad human consequence. So the task of regulatory moneyball is to try to make sure the overall human consequences are good, not bad. That's under the president's direction, what I felt was a key part of my job, make sure in an economically hard time we had high benefit, low cost rules. And just as a little signal of this, and the numbers don't tell the whole story, but they tell something, under President Bush in the first 3 years, the net benefits of regulations were a little over $3 billion. It's benefits minus costs, done by technical people, not political people. That's good. That's a tribute to President Bush that he had the net benefits, not in the millions or the 100 millions, but in the billions of dollars. And a lot of that's environmental benefits. The Obama administration, and just a few days ago, the numbers were finalized, having gone through peer review. Finalized after the book. I used the numbers, the draft numbers, but the final numbers turned out to be the same. A relief, $3 billion for Bush, over $90 billion for Obama. And that attests to the insistent focus on what are we getting for a rule that's costing money. If you're going to clean the air, make people a little safer in terms of food, how much safer? Is it a little meaning tiny or big? And how much is it going to cost? So regulatory moneyball concept number one. Concept number two is choice architecture. And here the idea is behind all of our choices, there is an architecture. So if you go to a website, Amazon, say, or Politics and Prose, there's an architecture there. If you are signing up for health insurance or financial aid or for a mortgage, there's an architecture there. There are things that are clear, there are things that are obscure, there are things that are in big print, there are things that are in little print. It turns out that if candy is in a green wrapper, that's part of the architecture of marketing, and people who are health conscious are more likely to buy it, even if it's just milk chocolate and cashew nuts. Green connotes health, and that's what people think. If you sign a form where you're supposed to tell the truth at the beginning, there's evidence that you're less likely to lie than if you sign it at the end. Signing at the beginning triggers honesty. And I think it's because people think they're on the line if they sign at the beginning, and their identity is kind of invested in truthfulness. Less so when they sign at the end. Google in New York had a cafeteria with an architecture which was pleasing to the palate and also to the stomach, in the sense there's a lot of high-calorie stuff that was highly visible and salient and delicious and irresistible. And the employees at Google said, "Help, we're getting fat." Google had what is sometimes called the nudge cafeteria, and I'll get to my third concept, which is nudge, in a moment, which didn't take away any foods, but which made the plates a little smaller, the healthy foods a little more visible, and the fattening foods a little trickier to find. As a result, people at Google are eating a lot less candy, and the employees report themselves as pretty happy. Concept number three. So there's regulatory moneyball, there's choice architecture, and there's nudge. Nudge was a title of a previous book that I co-authored with an economist who ought to, if it's a just world, get a Nobel Prize, Richard Thaler. The idea behind nudge is that we are all actually, by public or private institutions, being nudged by things that are preserving our freedom of choice, but which are steering us in one or another direction. And it would be desirable for the nudges to be helpful for us rather than harmful. A kind of core example of a nudge is a GPS. It nudges you. It tells you a way to get from one place to another. You can ignore it if you'd like to meander or take the scenic route or take your chances, but you're nudged by the GPS. There's a reform that private institutions have undertaken that the Obama administration's been pretty upbeat on, that is emphatically a nudge, and that is automatic enrollment in savings plans. The idea is if you're automatically enrolled by a default rule, it says you're in unless you say you want to get out, you'll be saving a lot more money and doing a lot better in retirement. And the data suggests that automatic enrollment in a savings plan actually has a bigger impact on people's savings rates than significant tax incentives. That's a very suggestive finding, because automatic enrollment is costless. The taxpayers don't have to pay a nickel. It just says you're in unless you say you want out. That saves more money, produces more savings for people than big tax incentives, which puts taxpayers on the hook. I think we need to do a lot more thinking in the next generation about simple, clear default rules that give sense and help the benefit of the doubt. Default rules are all around us. They determine what happens if we do nothing, and they tend to be really sticky because doing nothing is often what human beings will choose to do. I can tell you this does appear in the book. I had a very excellent staff consisting of civil servants whose politics, who knows, they really just want to do a good job, promote the interests of the American people, and comply with the law. Still, they thought it was a legitimate part of their job when the political stakes were high to alert me to the fact that an interest group would get exercised and maybe have some political reaction if we did what they didn't want. So occasionally they'd tell me about what an interest group was threatening, or that it was threatening. And my response was, that's sewer talk, get your mind out of the gutter. which I said with a smile, and it wasn't a reprimand, and they took it as a friendly thing to say, because they were civil servants, not political people. The idea was the government should be doing the right thing, and it is really gutter stuff to think you won't do something because an interest group is exercised. Now, if an interest group has a point and a legitimate objection, that's a whole different matter. That needs careful attention. But the fact of political threat or pressure. Okay, the second chapter is called The Most Dangerous Man in America. And I was a law professor for many years, and I was at the University of Chicago and had friends of all different ideological stripes and respected them, and was stunned to find that I became, well, there's a scene in George Orwell's 1984 where there are 2 minutes of hate that the party directs against a guy actually named Goldstein. And you see his face, and then you go crazy with, and Glenn Beck decided I was hate-worthy. And that was kind of the extreme. I saw hardly any of his shows, but I'm told this happened. That was the extreme version of what I encountered in the confirmation process. So here's a little bit on what that's like. This is, I think, the only account we have. There'll be more of what it's actually like. So I'm going to tell you what it's like to be nominated for a Senate-confirmed job. Before my nomination could be sent to the Senate, I was subjected to the nightmarish process known as vetting, which entails an exceedingly careful look by the White House at a potential nominee's background, including speeches, articles, books, personal life. Yes, they consulted my ex-wife. Yes, it was okay. And taxes. Think of this as a life audit by a team of people who have a far broader mandate than the Internal Revenue Service. Your whole life is an open book. Unfortunately for my vetters, I have written countless speeches, well over 400 articles, and a lot of books. They're all back there, and some might be, discounted a lot. Maybe they haven't sold that well, but they're available. The vetters had to sift through thousands of pages to ensure I hadn't said anything that was inexplicable or beyond the pale. I don't have copies of most of my speeches. I tend to speak from notes, witness today, and no one could be expected to wade through 400 articles. So the vetting process was not a lot of fun. A small, intrepid team nonetheless did its best. It found nothing obviously disqualifying, but there were plenty of red flags. For example, I had written about animal rights, suggesting that lawyers should be able to represent abused animals to sue for violations of animal cruelty laws. I'd also said in oral remarks captured on video that sport hunting should be banned. Ouch. I know. That's a bad idea. I know. Without endorsing the idea, I had discussed the possibility of a kind of fairness doctrine for the internet, calling on politically opposed sites to link to each other. Ouch again. I hadn't endorsed the idea, and actually I later repudiated it, but still a bad one. I'd written about abortion, same-sex marriage, pornography, human cloning, and guns. For those who wanted to make trouble for a presidential nomination, I must have seemed a dream come true. Going through all this material was grueling, but the tax issue turned out to be a lot more difficult. This was so not because of any anticipated problem, but because presidential nominees have to devote a lot of time and effort and money to a careful investigation to ensure that there was nothing troublesome from past years or even decades. In my case, things looked essentially fine, but I didn't remember everything, and my tax accountant, then in his early 80s, faced a barrage of hard questioning from the White House. Can you imagine? 80-something guy, Massachusetts, the White House calling, "Why did you do this in 1996? That happened a lot. As the scrutiny intensified, I started to worry every day that some notice would arrive from the IRS, destroying my prospects and embarrassing me publicly. As it happened, I was a bit late in making a payment to DC for employment compensation for my son's nanny. Fortunately, not a catastrophe. I was finally nominated in late April. The vetting was just the start of the process. Like many presidential nominees, I learned to live with the simple fact of life. In the modern era, whatever might be thought will be said. That's in italics. Whatever might be thought will be said. That is just the fact. It's fact actually about the books now that the book's been published. Some progressive groups were skeptical or hostile. For them, OIRA, my office, was not merely an obstacle, but evil, the place where indispensable public protections went to die. They expressed acute disappointment that the president chose someone who favored cost-benefit analysis. As it turned out, nudges weren't wildly popular on the left, which often preferred for mandates. But the most serious problems emerged on the right. It was widely reported that I was a radical animal rights activist who would seek to ban hunting, ban conspiracy theories, outlaw marriage. I had recently been married. Eliminate free speech, and steal human organs. Organ stealing, it turned out, is not entirely irrelevant to nudging. Really. I might discuss that later. Some conservatives began to characterize me as an extremist, a socialist, a Marxist, a Trotskyite, a police state fascist, and some kind of Rothschild Zionist. I confess I have no idea what that is. If anyone knows, maybe tell me what a Rothschild Zionist is. Wild rumors spread about what I thought and planned to do, an irony or perhaps destiny's joke, in view of the fact that I had finished a book on the top of false rumors and how they spread just a few months before. Animals turned out to be a major issue, though they occupied a very small fraction of my time when I was an academic. The Consumer Federation of America wrote that I had, quote, a secret aim to push a radical animal rights agenda in the White House. It wrote, Sunstein supports giving animals the legal right to file suits and using government regulations to phase out meat consumption. Sunstein's work could spell the end of animal agriculture, retail sales of dairy foods, fishing, biomedical research, pet ownership, zoos and aquariums, traveling circuses, and countless other things Americans take for granted. OMG, as they say. 15 conservation and sportsmen's organizations sent a group letter to the Senate asking to block my nomination. The National Wild Turkey Federation appeared to see my defeat as a particularly high priority. The Sportsmen's Alliance described me as a rabid animal rightist. That's kind of an odd adjective, rabid. They emphasized the need for sportsmen to take up their arms to block this czar, who would otherwise be given the power to, and these are quotes, to impose these views on all of us and destroy our collective heritage. On national television, former Governor Mike Huckabee, who I kind of admire, actually, invited me to South Arkansas during the opening day of deer season to see the, quote, reaction, unquote, that, quote, I would not enjoy, unquote, in light of my proposal to ban hunting. That's kind of mean. A representative headline from a blog post, Regulator Czar Sunstein defends stealing organs from hopeless patients. Another described me as a murderous nutcase. The influential American Farm Bureau expressed its strong concerns to Congress. That was worrisome. My heart sank. Opposition from the Bureau is no light matter, and it would get a lot of attention in the Senate. I met with them twice. They were earnest, informed, substantive, mildly suspicious, and nervous. Would I really try to stop people from eating meat? Would my motto be put cows first? Under the circumstances, I know and knew that these were natural questions for them to ask, but I had no interest in doing anything of the sort. Nonetheless, the die was cast. This would be an ugly and highly contentious confirmation process. I'll just tell you now that I had met successively with 3 senators, all of whom had put holds on me, which meant I couldn't even get a vote. And I met with them. It was very hard to get a meeting with them. It took weeks. They were very nice. They successively lifted their holds, which meant they were not going to be responsible for no vote. But I still couldn't get a vote. And we still don't know exactly why. I did learn in the midst of this quasi-nightmare that powerful Republican-leading business organizations, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, actually supported my confirmation. on the ground that I cared about reducing costs. They'd been quiet, in part on the ground that their support could turn the Democrats and progressive groups against me. But they decided that it was time to make their views publicly known. Not a lot of Obama appointees have public endorsement from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. Nonetheless, we were lucky enough to get their support. But not yet. During the confirmation process, the commentator and best-selling writer Glenn Beck developed what appeared to be a kind of obsession with me. I'm using that word advisedly. Apparently, he discussed me on the air well over 100 times. In his view, nudges are a form of manipulation, insidious, sneaky, scary, secret, slimy, smelly, shady. He decided and said repeatedly on national television while pointing to a picture of me that I was the most dangerous man in America. Sometimes he prefaced most dangerous with most evil, as in most evil, most dangerous man in America. Considering the fact that the nation has a large number of murderers, that is quite a statement. He provided a series of conspiracy theories with arrows pointing from one person's face to another person's face, culminating in the claim that the head of OIRA has, quote, one of the most powerful jobs in the world. On several occasions, he said, first it's nudge, then it's shove, then it becomes shoot. He said that I control everything through nudges. I began to receive a lot of hate mail, including death threats, at my unlisted home address. One of them said, if I were you, I would resign immediately. A well-paid individual who is armed knows where you live. And for reasons that remain mysterious to this day, I was still unable to get a vote in the United States Senate. Samantha, I'm sure, remembers very vividly one particular death threat that was, we had to go to the Secret Service on it. It was I wasn't very worried, but at our unlisted home address, it wasn't her favorite moment, I don't think, of our marriage. That was not the highlight of our marriage. Our only option was to seek to break the filibuster with a cloture vote, which requires 60 votes and requires the Senate to set aside 30 hours for discussion of yours truly. Is it necessary to say that this too seems surreal? Senator Reid, the majority leader, was kind enough to call me to say that he'd ensure such a vote. On the day, September 9th, 2009, I was put on the phone with a number of fence-sitting senators to explain that I was not going to steal guns, ban hunting, or focus on rodents. Ultimately, the Senate voted 63 to 35 in my favor, allowing, that's not confirmation, that allows an up or down vote. It's pretty close, 63-35. Glenn Beck covered the vote live on national television, showing the proceedings on the Senate floor while telling his viewers ominously that if I was confirmed they were, quote, in danger, unquote. He added, it is time to get everyone you know to call Capitol Hill because Sunstein is the most dangerous guy out there right now. The next day, the Senate voted for confirmation by a pretty nail-biting margin, 57 to 40. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont voted against me on the ground I was too far to the right. I had a pleasant enough conversation with him on the day of the vote. On reflection, maybe not pleasant enough, in which he accused me with a tinge of rage of being biased in favor of big banks and wanting to prevent any regulation of them. I still have no idea where he got that. Minutes after the favorable tally, the president invited me to the Oval Office for a congratulatory visit. Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff at the time, was the first to greet me in the Oval, saying with evident sarcasm, 57 to 40, that's a landslide. It's hard to capture the true terribleness of the contemporary public confirmation process. The life audit, the risk of a highly public humiliation, the repeated efforts to destroy one's reputation, the accusations, the falsehoods, the threats, the difficulty of engaging skeptics on the merits. What you learn, but what is almost impossible to appreciate, really it's psychologically, I think, very close to impossible, is that most of the attacks, however personal they seem, aren't personal at all. They actually have nothing to do with the human being at whom they are aimed. But as an Obama cabinet official told me when I asked one day how he was doing, I have no complaints that you want to hear about. I was blessed to have the opportunity to work in the federal government. 3 points stand out above all others, and they deserve special emphasis. Here's a remarkable fact about human cognition. People stop making certain mistakes, which the species is prone to, when they start speaking in a language with which they're not entirely familiar. There are a bunch of mistakes we make in terms of our cognition and understanding that we don't make when we're speaking in a second language. The reason is that we start playing moneyball in a second language. Then we're deliberating, we're working hard, we're not relying on our intuitions anymore. The part of the brain that's fast and automatic doesn't get Francais or Espanol, only gets the familiar language. People stop making mistakes. We think more deliberatively and we slow down. In government, I learned that cost-benefit analysis, and this is lesson 1, is in a sense a foreign language, and it works for that reason. It helps to discipline intuitions that can lead in unfortunate and potentially dangerous directions. It counteracts both hysteria and neglect. True, we shouldn't put public policy in an arithmetic straitjacket. Some values, such as human dignity, cannot easily be turned into monetary equivalents, but we need more and better cost-benefit analysis. The second lesson involves the sources of unnecessary complexity. And tax day wasn't so long ago. Over 7 billion annual hours Americans spend on taxes. That's a lot. It's in monetized form, that is more than the budget of some cabinet departments. Okay. The government's full of hard-working people who have chosen to make a career of public service, and really my hat's off to them. They're not making a lot of money, they're not getting a lot of applause, and they are extraordinary. They're highly professional, they know their areas, and they're specialists. Even when rules are complex, frustrating, and incomprehensible to the public, though, they tend to seem simple and straightforward to those who wrote them, because the rule writers are experts. Chess masters can immediately read a board, and in a fraction of a second, a professional tennis player knows how to handle a blistering cross-court backhand. So too, rule writers understand the meaning of jargon-filled terms and requirements that seem impossibly baffling to those who are subject to them. Much of what I did in government, and many of the recommendations made in this book, are meant to encourage the people who write the rules to step back and to reduce the strain on the people who are required to understand the rules. That's the plea for simplification. The third, and actually the most important lesson, involves the public. Public officials know a lot. They're amazing. But inevitably, they lack information that members of the public have. Suppose the government is adopting a rule that will make cars safer, or that will reduce costs now imposed on doctors and nurses, take costs away. The automobile industry knows a lot about the likely effects of safety rules. Doctors and nurses have a ton of information about the likely effects of efforts to cut down costs and red tape. Public officials need to find out what they know. They need to respect what we might call regulatory due process. Time and again, government officials learn from public comments on proposed rules. This was my biggest surprise, really, in government, the extent to which learning what the public knows is fundamental to not erring in government. Greater simplification of the rules promotes informed public comments, and informed public comments promote simplification. It's not just sensible to provide people with an opportunity to comment on rules before they're finalized. It's indispensable, a crucial safeguard against error. This is partly a point about the sovereignty of we the people, about self-government and political legitimacy, but it's more than that. It's a point about mistakes and about how to avoid them. It's a point about choice architecture for choice architects. True, rules are not improved by sloganeering, fact-free letter-writing campaigns, or special pleading from interest groups. No gutter talk. If our goal is regulatory moneyball, regulations should not be designed by referendum. But crucial information often comes from people in the private sphere, which has unique access to that information about costs, about benefits, about what works and what doesn't, about unintended bad consequences, about unintended good consequences, about what is too complex and what is too simple. Here then is a final nudge. Those who have the privilege of serving the American people should listen closely to those whom they are privileged to serve. So one idea was people who understand about information processing know that the old USDA food pyramid is kind of incomprehensible, not likely to provide much guidance. And so we replaced it with the food plate, not thinking as a government the food plate is a good nudge, but thinking that the food plate is a good mix of nutritional advice and intelligibility, as the food pyramid wasn't. You may notice the new fuel economy labels, which put up front annual fuel savings and savings over 5 years compared to the average car or expenditure. And that was informed by what both empirical research and what we know from other areas about how people process information, a problem-centered approach. And there were a number of other things done that are described in the book about simplification, default rules, and disclosure that actually works. And it's not unfair to say that some of those things are nudges, but the theory was, how do we have a policy that actually is successful in informing people or in ensuring that kids can apply to college without being overwhelmed by unnecessary detail? That was the simplification of the financial aid form. Ask what? So I guess the general answer is that I think it wouldn't have been right for me. In fact, I know it would have been wrong for me to say I want to put hardwire nudging into the federal government. That would have been narcissism on steroids. I wanted to have a regulatory system that protected public health, welfare, and the environment while promoting economic growth and job creation. That's what the president wanted me to do. It is true that the executive order that really defines the president's regulatory approach, 13563, which is an appendix in the book, maybe the most important pages in the book are the president's words, not mine. In fact, unquestionably, those are the most important words, except the words about Samantha at the very end. Those are pretty important, too. She's shaking her head. She hates that I said that. The president does have in Section 3 a directive to the agencies that they identify and consider approaches that maintain freedom of choice for the American public, including disclosure and warnings and appropriate default rules. So that is a recognition of the potential value. I wouldn't put it in my government capacity or capacity as former government person, a recognition of nudges. It's a recognition of the value of certain low-cost, high-impact tools, and that part of the executive order does put it into the system. I do think that a number of people inside the government, of course, and this has nothing to do with, zero to do with me, know behavioral economics. So we have, I have a part of the book that I talk about being a kid at the University of Chicago, the land of rational choice economics, with these people who were giants. They were all like 8 or 9 feet tall. Even Milton Friedman, who I think was 5 feet tall, was 8 or 9 feet tall. They were giants. And when I thought as a kid law professor of their rationality assumption as a little fairy tale, especially when they were talking about everyone's rational and they themselves were maybe divorced or complaining about their bad investment decisions or making crazy shots on the tennis court. But I didn't have any tools. And then these tools came along, and Kahneman has a Nobel Prize. Peter Diamond, who has edited a book on behavioral economics, has a Nobel Prize. George Akerlof has a Nobel Prize. There's so many Nobel Prizes. So the people in government know behavioral stuff now. It's part of the repertoire. And that means that behaviorally informed approaches, any government, Republican or Democrat, is going to be inquiring into.
If you look back from the time the office was implemented, Reagan had a person in your position, George Bush's father had one, and so forth. Have you looked and seen, did they have the same kind of problems for appointment, and it wasn't you personally, it was the office that threatened, that bothered.
Yes, it is true. I haven't done it systematically, but I know that Susan Dudley, my immediate predecessor, I think she was a recess appointment. I think she couldn't get a vote, or certainly couldn't get through, and John Graham had a delay. I think mine was especially colorful, but I was not unique. And look, under Republican and Democratic presidents, a lot of people have confirmation challenges, let's say.
Thank you.
You said a couple of minutes ago that people stop making some important mistakes when they speak in a foreign language. As I am a law professor at the University of Geneva, it's a French-speaking part of Switzerland, I have now a big advantage. Well, but my comment and my question, yeah, it's for me an excellent idea to evaluate and to make cost analysis of regulation of agencies and government regulation. And but in Switzerland or even in Germany, for example, parliaments and not only government or agency can be forced to evaluate the impact, the efficiency and of the legislation. And you will find such obligation in the law enacted by the parliament or even in the constitution. And my question is, now, would it be a positive, a good idea, actually, to extend this cost efficiency analysis in the United States to the legislation itself and not only to the activity of the agencies, and to simplify the law itself? When you take the Obamacare Act, for example, it's not an example of simple text. And my question is, if yes, would it be possible to find an obligation in the Constitution, in the U.S. Constitution itself, for example?
Okay, great questions there. It would be an adventurous interpretation of the U.S. Constitution that saw an obligation to consider costs and benefits as implicit in any of its provisions. So the constitutional question is straightforward. The only thing that could be said is there's a kind of background check on arbitrary action under the Due Process Clause. And if you had an agency or Congress doing something that had huge costs and no benefits, it might be arbitrary. But it's very hard to flunk the arbitrariness test under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses. Courts strike those things down rarely. A little point on the relationship between other nations and the U.S. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, and I did chair the Regulatory Cooperation Council with the EU. There's a regulatory impact analysis that's done, but it doesn't have the force of law. So if the Parliament wants to go forward, notwithstanding, it's not forbidden, at least at the EU level in the UK. In the U.S., we don't have a formal requirement that Congress analyze costs and benefits before it goes forward. Inside the executive branch, we in the U.S. have a much more mandatory cost-benefit system, in the sense that OIRA, my old office, has formal veto power. Now, the president's ultimately in charge, and if a cabinet head says, OIRA, you're full of nonsense, we want the president to overrule you, that's perfectly legitimate. But there is a formal mechanism to require cost-benefit analysis, and to the extent permitted by law, to make sure the benefits justify the costs. That's not true in Europe. I don't have a particular view on whether Congress should systematically engage in cost-benefit analysis. I'm very favorably disposed toward cost-benefit analysis, whether we should have an institutional change so that Congress does it as a matter of course or regularly. Need to study the costs and benefits of that requirement before having a judgment. On Obamacare, just a little notation. I'm not seeing, this is a good thing, I'm not seeing any cell phones out. Please don't take them out. Suggests you're not really bored. The technology behind a cell phone is extremely complicated. Probably the documents that were necessary to produce it were a lot longer than 905 pages, which is the length of Obamacare, and the lines of code involved in what people hold in their hands, immensely complicated. But for the user, it's simple and straightforward. So my suggestion is that the focus on the length of pages of a law is really not right. It's tempting to think that if you have a really long law, then that's a form of damaging complexity. Maybe, but not necessarily. The Department of Health and Human Services released just a couple days ago a form for applying for the health insurance exchanges whose substantive content is 2 pages, which compares very favorably to the private sector applications. And that's very cool, because the private sector has a strong economic incentive to make it easy for people to get in the system. The U.S. government has actually been simpler than that. So I think the thing to watch with Obamacare is when there's an interaction between actual human beings and the government. Is it chaotic and complicated, or is it like an iPad? Now, surely it's going to be somewhere in between, but maybe it'll have more simplification in it than some people fear. Hope so. Thank you.
At the beginning, you said that obviously the goal is simplicity, but not necessarily shrinking the size of government. And I was just curious how you would respond to the public choice critics who would say that no matter what you do, once you start putting the government in the realm of regulation, it inevitably will be corrupted, as you saw very much with your own confirmation process.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So the topic of the book is simplification, not smaller. That doesn't mean that smaller isn't a good idea. So the fact that the book is about simplification is not inconsistent with the view that government should be smaller. That's just another book. So I believe in some domains government should be smaller, some important domains, but that's not what the book's about. Public choice theory, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is the idea that there's inevitable corruption in the sense that government is pushed around by interest groups, and we have to recognize the role of economic self-interest. My experience of government, and the principal person behind public choice theory recently died, a guy named James Buchanan. He's a great man with capital G, capital M. My experience of government has made me much more skeptical of public choice theory than I was before government. And the reason is that all the time newspapers would report that a decision, whether it went to the left or the right or the center by the Obama administration, was driven by interest groups. And nothing could be further from the truth. So at least within the executive branch, the interest groups, the public choice was a hopelessly primitive and crude picture of government behavior. If people came in and talked to IRA about, we hate this, we're going to fight this with everything we've got, this is very bad, and we're going to embarrass the president or something. Talk to the hand. If they came in and said, this is going to hurt economic growth, and there's a way you can do it that will not have an adverse effect on real people, now we're talking. If a public interest, there's a famous thing, it was in the newspaper, where a public interest group came with a lot of political power, came in and talked to the White House about how some environmental regulation was very popular. The polls so suggested. Public choicey thing from the progressive side. And famously, it shouldn't have leaked. It did leak. Bill Daley, the chief of staff, said, I don't give a something about polls. And this, I don't remember the word he used, but it might have been a 4-letter one. And it was phrased in the press as if this was a scandalous thing he said. That's how he thought. He wanted to do the right thing. If this had, very high benefits for the American people, if it was going to save 5,000 lives a year, that's relevant. Polls know. And so I think public choice theory, as it's deployed in the academy, is, thank goodness we have it. It's a hugely important contribution, but I think we scale it down. It's a piece of the picture. I didn't see much of Congress. Maybe in Congress it's more powerful, but in terms of what you see from the executive branch, whether it's Republican or Democratic, I think, I must say, I think it's what's it like? It's like it's an easy argument to make, and its empirical reality is, let's say, not as solid as one would think. My experience. And other OIRA administrators, Republican administrations, I strongly expect they'd say the same thing.
Criticisms basically of OMB, but OIRA oversees it in the public health arena and environmental arenas, that many of these rulemakings, they go into the system, they never come out, they're there for years, there's thousands of public comments, these public comments don't get responded to. I don't know the reason for it. First, do you agree with that? And then if you do agree with it, why is this the case? Is it just that there's so many comments you can't even respond to them?
I'll tell you, I know many people are concerned with the fact that under Democratic and Republican administrations, regulations have sometimes been at OIRA for a long time. Keep in mind, in my time there, about 3 years, we issued nearly 2,000 rules. That's a lot. And that's fewer than previous. So the idea that the rules are getting stuck, just not so. The vast majority come out. When they get stuck at OIRA, here are some of the reasons it may get stuck. It's not OIRA very frequently. There's someone at the Department of Justice who says, this rule isn't legally defensible. It's going to get struck down. And there's very careful work with the Department of Justice to make sure that it's legal. And there may be someone in the General Counsel's office at the rulemaking agency who says, we think it's okay. And the Department of Justice will say, we have to defend you, and we don't. And then the person at the agency will say, well, let's work together and see what we can do. And OIRA is a convener of that process.
Do you have an example of an environmental one?
I could not, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to give examples. But I can tell you that that happens. Or you might have a rule, there's a cost-benefit analysis that accompanies the rule. It's really important for transparency and possibly for legality, where the Council of Economic Advisors will say, it's not up to professional standards yet. No one in the government does shoddy work, but not up to the kind of professional standards which the Council of Economic Advisors speaks for. They're really good there. And if there's an economic analysis, it had better meet their standards. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, headed by John Holdren, a very important partner of OIRA. I took AP Bio, and I'm proud to say that I did pretty well on that because I kind of understood photosynthesis, and that is impressive, I know. So, but I don't know any science. And so there'd be scientific judgments from an agency, and you need to make sure the scientists within the federal government were okay with it, that the President's science advisor stood by it. And that sometimes would take some time. There might be a rule where some important person in the federal government who is not working for OIRA says it's not good. It's bad policy. And at least under ordinary circumstances, the OIRA administrator can't say to a cabinet head, we're going to issue the rule over your intense objection, unless the president wants that. So my job was frequently to work together with the various people to see if we could meet the objections. By the way, a lot of the rules that are at OIRA for a long time has nothing to do with OIRA. It's that the OIRA assembles comments, they go back to the agency, and the agency doesn't do anything because it has other higher priorities. So there are a lot of rules that I was, interested in getting out, and the rulemaking agency was not that focused on it. So the story of the reason things are there for a while, it was always an honorable story. I can't think of a single one where it wasn't honorable. It might be that there was some important person with a policy objection. And if it was a crazy policy objection, then we could talk it through. But if it's a reasonable policy objection, you can't just say sorry, unless the president ultimately has the authority. But he tends to set general principles rather than intervene in 2,000 cases.
I think we have to end it there. Thank you